Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Labubu. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Labubu's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Labubu slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Labubu tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Labubu, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red, his smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing. Like two glass orbs. No emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this. Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiro's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiro raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him, "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. They were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches, its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise," whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if two more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. It was very early in the morning when Peppa first heard it. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed when a soft, rhythmic knocking came from her bedroom door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard a voice, monotone and strange, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Tun, tun, tun, sahur." Peppa sat up in her bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Who's there?" she called out, but the knocking continued. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," came the voice again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and Peppa slowly approached the door. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing in the hallway was a strange yellow creature with large round eyes and a wooden stick in its hand. The creature looked at Peppa with those unblinking eyes and said just one word, "Sahur." Before Peppa could ask any questions, the creature turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Peppa closed the door quickly, her heart pounding, but sleep would not come again that night. The next morning at breakfast, Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange visitor. "Mummy, Daddy, someone came to my room this morning. They were knocking and saying tun 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 sahur," she explained excitedly. Daddy Pig just laughed. "Peppa, you must have been dreaming. Sahur is just a morning meal that some people have. Your imagination is getting the better of you." Mummy Pig nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear, don't make up scary stories. Now eat your breakfast." But just as they were talking, a rhythmic tapping sound came from outside the house. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" Peppa jumped up from her chair. "Do you hear that?" "That's him!" she cried. The family listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Later that day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when the yellow creature appeared again. It emerged from behind the bushes, still carrying its wooden stick, and began walking slowly around their yard. "Tun, tun, tun," it said monotonously, tapping the stick against the ground with each word. George hid behind Peppa, frightened by the strange visitor. Peppa, though scared, tried to be brave. "What do you want?" she asked. The creature stopped and looked at her. It held out its stick, offering it to Peppa. "Sahur," it said simply. Peppa didn't take the stick. She watched as the creature continued its slow walk around the garden, tapping and chanting its mysterious phrase. That night, Peppa had terrible nightmares. She dreamed she was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dozens of yellow creatures, all carrying sticks and chanting "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" in perfect unison. When she woke up in a cold sweat, she looked out her window and saw the creature standing in the garden, staring up at her room. Days passed, and something strange began happening to Peppa's family. They became quiet and listless. Every morning they would sit at the breakfast table in complete silence, eating their food without speaking, then drift apart to their rooms like sleepwalkers. One morning, Peppa watched in horror as Daddy Pig picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against the table. "Tun, tun, tun," he said in the same monotone voice as the creature. Soon, Mummy Pig joined in, and then George, all of them tapping and chanting together. The final morning came when Peppa ran outside, desperate to escape the strange behavior of her family. But what she saw in the garden made her blood run cold. The entire yard was filled with yellow creatures, all holding wooden sticks. In the center stood her family, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George, each holding a stick of their own. They all turned to look at Peppa with blank, emotionless eyes. Tun, 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 sahur. They chanted in unison, their voices blending with those of the creatures around them. One of the yellow beings approached Peppa and held out a wooden stick. Peppa looked at her transformed family, then at the stick being offered to her. She realized there was no escape, no way back to the life she once knew. Slowly, with trembling hands, Peppa reached out and took the stick. Sahur, she whispered, her voice already beginning to match the monotone of the others. And so Peppa joined her new family, walking slowly around the garden with the yellow creatures, tapping her stick and chanting the endless phrase that had consumed them all. The morning ritual had claimed another victim, and somewhere in the distance the sound of tun 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 sahur continued to echo, waiting for the next family to find. Peppa Pig, the forgotten friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone.